Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 8 of Series 11. The question for today is, what are the strengths and weaknesses of Christian and religious ethics? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 3, Section 1. Religious ethics is thought to be discredited by its fixed and dictated injunctions, as well as the fact that God does not exist. This is why it's called divine command theory. It is because morally right means commanded by God and morally wrong means forbidden by God. Yet there are many other versions of religious ethics that we will look at here. For example, historical, social and mythological or metaphorical versions of religious ethics. But the idea that ethics or morality needs God is a good place to start, and this is an idea that is widely discussed and debated. Dostoevsky argued, for example, that belief in God is essential for objective morality because if there is no God, everything is permitted, but this assumes that there are no other reasons for morality to exist. And like others, Slavoj Žižek replied that if there is a God, then anything is permitted. This response is echoed by Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins and Jonathan Haidt, with the view that religious justification enables people to do very bad things. That is, of course, as well as very good things. But the point is that belief in or the existence of God isn't essential for objective or normative morality. I say normative morality because depending on what objective means, objective morality can be contradictory. And as a basic argument for normative morality is that a psychologically healthy person doesn't want to be mean, greedy, vindictive, selfish, or to be the kind of person who normally steals, lies for no good reason, or attacks or kills other people. We will later look at practical reasons why applied or normative ethics don't have debilitating problems. The sociologist Peter Berger, for example, presents a process of externalization and objectification of moral values. And Richard Dawkins shows how ethical values can be genetically selected in social life. Yet believers in a need for God have a point, because as I have argued in this series, moral philosophy has no definitively adequate and comprehensive theory of ethics to offer. That is, of course, excluding the value theory of ethics with which I will conclude this series. And all other theories of ethics, including virtue theory, utilitarianism and Kantian ethics, have fatal flaws which exclude them as viable explanations of morality. Buddhism is an interesting case here because it can be seen as a practical guide of cause and effect, rather than a system of ethics that involves moral judgments of good or evil. And Buddhism significantly is also ambivalent about belief in God linked to moral systems. Yet in the sphere where God exists, religious ethics seems to have certain advantages. Firstly, an omniscient and benevolent God will be able to give unerring and detailed ethical injunctions. But as we will see, the development and diversity of particular religious injunctions renders such injunctions manifestly unreliable and relative. But secondly, a religious ethics presided over by a God seems to resolve a difficult problem for secular ethics. That is, the is-ought problem that fact, theory or reason by itself cannot establish moral obligations. But God is a person who, like other persons, can impose moral obligations on others. And God is a perfect person who could call for absolute moral obligations. But this claim is undermined by questions about both God's existence and whether absolute moral obligation is a coherent idea. On that point, we might still retain the idea of God, but as part of Feuerbach's projection theory of religion. That is, mankind doesn't understand himself as he is, so he projects his understanding outside of himself. So mankind's perception of God's love or value is thereby mankind's own self-love, unquote. And God as mankind's self-love is also the believer's highest value. Yet the idea of God simply as the believer's highest value is almost a truism, and it is been endorsed by people like St. Anselm, Descartes, Spinoza and Leibniz, as well as Feuerbach himself. And if God is not the believer's highest value, God would have to be replaced by another. More to the point, the idea of God as the believer's highest value sets up religion as an effective theory of ethics. This is because ethics is also regarded as a primary value, and ethical principles are values that guide moral action. Also within the scope of value, a meaningful life is also a worthwhile and valuable life, lit up by values. And value is, of course, central to my account of a philosophy of life. But although religion might be presented as relevant to ethics and value, it still has a lot of problems in this respect, such as the idea of God as an ethical value rests on mythology, because God does not seem to exist. And even if that ethical value can be justified, it is still only a basic principle that needs details. This need of content and detail is illustrated by the many competing ideas about religious ethics. So we should examine some of these problems now, such as the non-existence of God has been presupposed here, so a brief argument should be outlined to that effect. I previously presented many such arguments, including Feuerbach's psychological projection theory. But in my view, the most convincing is a comparison of God with a fictional character like Spider-Man. We are sure that Spider-Man doesn't exist, but because we understand the circumstances of his appearance. That is, we understand historical origins of where the stories come from. We understand their social functions for children and their role in comic books. And we also understand the psychological satisfactions and the motivations of their creators. And for the same reasons, as well as for philosophical objections, we can also be certain that God does not exist. That is, the historical, social and psychological circumstances of the idea of God can be understood. This argument can be stated very quickly, but understanding those circumstances takes a long time. So God as the highest value, as the factual basis of religious ethical principles, is in doubt, but so is its details. But my undergraduate studies recall Rudolf Schnackenberg finding certain guidelines in the New Testament. These were love, community, justice, holiness, virtuous character, and mutual Christian support. Yet the New Testament is a radical message of salvation about the last days, not details on how to live. And ethical teaching is incidental or general, like in the Sermon on the Mount. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus emphasizes intention, equating anger with murder and lust with adultery. Yet apart from a new emphasis on intention, ethical values are largely the conventional ones of honesty, humility, authenticity, truthfulness, promise-keeping and sincerity. And such conventions raise issues about divorce, the role of women, the treatment of non-believers and slavery. For instance, we find an endorsement of slavery at Colossians 3:22, or the failure to admonish it at Luke 7:2. And other lapses occur, like the killing of Herod by an angel for not praising God, Acts 12:21, the death of Ananias and his wife as a result of not giving all their money to Peter, Acts 5:1, and the cursing of sinners into the everlasting fires of hell, Matthew 25:41. These events reveal a less forgiving heritage, yet inconsistency and lack of detail in the New Testament prompts the continuing development of ethics through church history. It's said, for example, that whereas Protestantism is made by the New Testament, Catholicism has made the New Testament. That is, from the Catholic viewpoint, the Church existed before the New Testament was compiled. The final 27 books were chosen by the Council of Rome, 382 AD, Hippo, 393 AD, and Carthage, 397 AD. And I have in my hand, as I write, the New Testament Apocrypha books not included in that list. This development of Christian ethics and doctrine continued through the history of the Church. In his theological political treatise, for example, Spinoza argued that Paul had institutionalized Christian teaching and made it compatible with Roman law, achieving Constantine's Christianization in 313 AD. Spinoza points out, for instance, that Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 7:20, "Let each one remain in the condition in which he was called." This message is well suited to conventional and imperial interests. Against such institutionalization, we have had the Protestant Reformation, liberation theology, and the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King. Liberation theology is making a claim about what Christian ethics should be focused on. It is, or was, largely a Latin American Catholic movement which attempts to address the problems of poverty and social injustice as well as spiritual matters. But this change in ethical focus has been thought to mistakenly move emphasis from spirituality to worldly affairs. And Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who became Pope Benedict XVI, criticized the movement for what he thought was excessive politicization and alignment with communist ideologies. Christian situation ethics differed to liberation theology by redefining the character of ethics rather than its focus. Leading situationalist Joseph Fletcher argues for this position in his book entitled Situation Ethics. He tells us that situation ethics differs from both antinomian without law and strict legalistic ethics. Fletcher argues, as I do, that, as he puts it, the rock bottom issue in all ethics is value. And he also writes that, consistent with a situational perspective, and we might add with utilitarianism and postmodernism, nothing is intrinsically good but the highest good, the summum bonum, love, unquote. But more precisely, love is a mode of value, and value yields other intrinsic values such as self-esteem and integrity. And as I argue elsewhere, the culmination of such intrinsic values leads to a certain sufficiency of value, as well as the nearly universal intrinsic value of people. But situation ethics implies an unargued preference for the principle of love that is suspiciously conventional, as well as the problem of determining detailed moral action, as it was for early Christianity. That is, non-cognitive states, like love, can't determine cognitively guided action, but I argue that value can. Yet the problem is mitigated for situation ethics as a Christian approach that presupposes certain assurances. These are the uncritical acceptance of certain moral conventions, a belief in the existence of an underlying moral order of good and evil, and the guidance of a good conscience informed by God. But without the existence of a benevolent and caring God, these assurances no longer exist, and religious situation ethics devolves into a pragmatic utilitarian or fragmented postmodern ethics, where everything is determined by the unique situation but without an overarching principle. Yet even with the overarching principle of love, the problem remains of determining practical action. That is, diverse preferences, ethical ambiguities, and different versions of tough love call for different actions. And this is a problem that will have to be resolved in a value theory ethics that similarly poses value as an overarching principle of life and morality. So love is both too specific as a mental state and too general in the kind of actions that it can motivate, whereas value as a will to value is a more general state that can lead to more specific kinds of action. Yet an argument for that claim will have to wait for several studies into the future. Although the absence of God is problematic, the claim that God is irrelevant to morality may be more destructive. The problem of relevance can be first posed by Euthyphro in Plato's dialogues with his question, isn't action wrong because God forbids it, or does God forbid it because it is wrong? If an action is wrong because God forbids it, then God could forbid or justify anything, even evil, which is absurd. And if God commands what is manifestly evil, we might reject this moral standard and reject this God. But if God forbids something because it is wrong, then God is appealing to an independent standard. So we can also appeal to that standard without referring to God, who becomes irrelevant. More unexpectedly, Immanuel Kant, who was a dedicated Christian, also poses an irrelevance to God to ethics. There are several reasons for this seeming irrelevance of God. One of them is that Kant said we cannot prove free will, immortality, or the existence of God, although he presents these as postulates needed to make sense of the world. Secondly, Kant held that morality can and must be determined through reason, not by faith or through feelings. That is, it must be determined through his categorical imperative of universalization, humanity, and autonomy. And autonomy for Kant means a free and informed exercise of choice. And this autonomy or choice is a third reason why Kant seems to present God as irrelevant to ethics and morals. It is because we must freely choose our moral maxims, and they can't be dictated from an external source. That is, we not only must choose to give the moral law to ourselves, but we must also authorize, justify, and adjudicate it for ourselves. Kant further held that the moral law is right, and because it is right, it is our duty to accept and follow it. Yet Elizabeth Anscombe provided us with both another reason for the irrelevance of God, as well as a critique of Kant's employment of duty as a motivating element. This is unexpected because Anscombe was both a Catholic and a practicing Christian. In her modern moral philosophy, she argued that the ideas of duty, obligation, and law given by God have been weakened or rejected, and that the concept of moral obligation and moral duty, the moral sense of ought to be jettisoned, and that these ideas should be replaced by virtues, as in a virtue theory perspective. These accounts of Paul, Spinoza, liberation theology, situation ethics, Aristotle, Kant and Anscombe show both the diversity and development of Christian ethics. Yet this development is further explained with the historical development of the idea of God and its ethical implications that led up to the particular nature of Christian ethics that also corresponds with an increasing awareness of subjectivity. And this historical development can be traced from animism through polytheism and to monotheism. Animism endows the activities of animals and the movements of nature with human or supernatural qualities. The reasoning is that I move and have spirit and will. Nature moves and therefore also has spirit and will. This is because animism has opaque capacities of self-awareness and makes unclear distinctions between mind and matter. Animism, or primitive animism, as it is called, projects human attributes into the external world, and its sacred objects consist of the feared, hunted and desired, the forces of nature and the beasts pursued. This provides the satisfactions of a oneness and unity with nature, as in the pre-fall state of Genesis. In this development, the gods of polytheism reflect particular values which take on more human-like attributes. Gods embody features such as war, death, life, love or wealth, or are humanized as Apollo and Zeus. And each god comes to represent a particular value. Yet monotheism brought aspirations and beliefs together within a single and unified perspective, and we would expect this integration to produce tremendous intellectual and psychological satisfaction. It would also produce a unified experience of value of a certain quality, power and substance. Moreover, different forms of monotheism also cater to different systems and values and ethics. Judaism, for example, provides a concept of God as creator and lawgiver. Islam produces an emphasis on unity, universality and transcendence. And Christianity emphasizes human subjectivity, compassion and moral intention. Before the Judeo-Christian era, and even before the evolutionary animal-human transition, the fundamental rule of behavior was might is right, and the earliest ethical principles retain the idea of might is right by kings and the powerful. Early Judaic ethics moderates power by an enforcement of rules together with an ethics of behavior. The Christian era heralds appreciation of subjectivity and concern for intention and intrinsic value of people. And this appreciation of subjectivity, intention and others is key in the development of Christian ethics. Conversely, ancient Greek ethics looked to excellence of character as a moral feature. Modern ethics appreciate subjectivity, psychological conditioning and intention retained and developed by Kant. But social and psychological conditions have almost replaced ethics previously determined by religion. The inception, practice and demise of religion thereby illustrates the development of moral values. So we return to the question of whether the demise of religion and belief in God also heralds the end of ethics. But this question is superseded by another, about an excessively materialistic conception of God. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, for example, doesn't believe in the God of atheists. William's issue is not so much doubt that God exists, but connecting with what's there. Similarly, standard debates about religion often focus on its truth or falsity or degrees thereof. This is the view of the four horsemen of the new atheism, Dennett, Dawkins, Hitchens and Sam Harris. But the apprehension and understanding of religion and value require more than rationalist thinking. And in my view, and the view of many others, the four horsemen have missed the point by focusing on literal truth. Rabbi Julia Neuberger, for example, argues that religion is more about action, fellowship, ethics and ritual. And Boltzmann, John Hick and Don Cupid have advanced non-realist interpretations of religion. And John Haldane, papal advisor, says that Christianity speaks to the brokenness of humanity. I myself look at religion and Christianity as a mythological phenomenology of value. But can we make sense of such a view of religious ethics under the hard stare of fact and philosophy? One philosophical response to the loss of objectivity is Simon Blackburn's notion of quasi-realism. Quasi-realism is a form of anti-realism that works to construct an objective fabric for the world. A standard explanation is that quasi-realism earns the right to talk objectively about things. This view can be compared to others and can be described in different ways. We can, for example, compare quasi-realism to Wittgenstein's anthropocentricity and Heidegger's being in the world. To both these thinkers, being and acting in the world is essential to constructing the reality of the world. In this way, reality or objectivity is earned or constructed by acting in the world. And this is similar to what Neuberger, Rowan and Williams are doing in a religious sphere. But this seems to have given up the original idea of God as a real and substantive being. Yet the idea of social construction of reality is a powerful modern theory reaching back into the recent past. We could look, for example, to social explanations of religion, such as Max Weber's and Emil Durkheim's. Durkheim regarded society as an expression of an underlying religious reality and sacred cosmos. Thomas Luckmann and Peter Berger then built on the work of both Weber and Durkheim. In Berger's view, mankind is in a relationship with a society that he creates, yet which also forms and supports him. It does this by holding back the threats of disorder, meaninglessness and death. And Berger explains how religion plays a vital part in maintaining the social fabric that does this. Berger employs a familiar three-phase process of externalization, objectification and internalization. This transforms society from a collection of individuals into a structure that gives direction and meaning. The individual externalizes his thoughts, values and behavior by reaching out to society and interacting with others. This behavior then becomes social practice, which is taken as the natural order of things and becomes objectified. But an individual must then internalize this objectification to avoid alienation and meaninglessness. Berger describes this internalization of objectification of mores as a personal world or nomos. But to reinforce that nomos, the individual needs his own conception of an objectified world or cosmos. To this end, Berger held that this legitimization of the social world is best performed by religion. That is, religion is held to be objective with social implications that is internalized. Berger describes the whole process of objectification and internalization as a theodicy. This is also a credible sociological explanation of religious belief in God. And Burge's account can be directly applied to the social construction of moral values in 3 steps. 1. There is agreement or consensus of what constitutes good or bad behaviour. 2. There is social objectification of this agreement in religious belief, law or cultural values. And 3. These objectified norms are internalised by individuals into their personal lives. This explains feelings of moral compulsion and motivation to do the right thing. But this process also explains ethical values which may not be moral. That is, there can be social agreement on any number of things that aren't moral, such as slavery, confessions obtained by torture, and genital mutilation. So general social experience can't be an adequate way of determining moral action. If social foundations aren't an adequate foundation for religious ethics, then we might turn to genetics. Wikipedia tells us that the God gene hypothesis proposes that human spirituality is influenced by heredity, and that a specific gene called the vesicular monoamine transporter 2 predisposes humans towards spiritual or mystical experiences. This idea has been proposed by geneticist Dean Hammer in the 2004 book called The God Gene: How Faith is Hardwired into Our Genes. But religious values are shaped by many factors, not just genes. Yet Richard Dawkins proposes a genetic rule of thumb for tribal life for ethical behaviour in the modern world. He reasons that groups of people who care for one another are more likely to thrive than ones that don't. He further reasons that, like other animals, this behaviour would become genetically encoded, and that this tribal altruism is transferred to the wider social situations of modern life. Yet this doesn't solve the problem of people who simply choose not to conform. It also doesn't resolve the problem of religious ethics. Also, since the 70s, the sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson has been claiming that science may soon be in a position to investigate the very origins and meaning of human values, unquote. But Wilson has since had to admit to not being able to show the obligatory force of values beyond their social or psychological consequences. But I'd finally like to say something in favour of religious ethics that follows from the idea of God as a believer's highest value and religion as a mythological phenomenology of value. Firstly, Feuerbach sees Christianity saying something special because it reveres mankind's true object of value, himself. Christianity does this because God becomes man and Christ is a mythological representative of all mankind. Again, this provides the satisfaction of valuing the true object of value, even if in symbolic form. Secondly, a phenomenology of religious value is thereby about mankind's highest values and about man himself. So religious mythology provides a way of understanding something that cannot be easily understood. That is the phenomena of consciousness and value that scientifically oriented philosophy neglects. There are many ways in which a phenomenology of religion does this. One of them is a conspicuous absence of the idea of consciousness projected into religious form, which Paul describes as, in him, God, we live and move and have our being. That is, the consciousness that is both supremely important and offers a new ontology. It is an ontology in which the first will be last and the last will be first. Another is the religious idea of human finitude described in phenomenology as a lack of being or insubstantiality. And in this phenomenological realm, one must believe, not know in order to be saved, that is saved from an unspoken religious dread of meaninglessness and a life without purpose. And in this condition of lack, Christian belief and doctrine becomes a supportive cognitive framework as an object of phenomenological intentionality. So in conclusion, we can ask again, what are the strengths and weaknesses of Christian and religious ethics? But we have found that as a theoretical basis for either the justification of a central principle or as guidance for specific action, religious ethics falls short. Its central principle rests on a God whose existence is questionable at best, and its ethical injunctions are an anachronistic mixture of revolutionary aspirations, conventional values, and their development and diversity that undermine their credibility. This development and diversity was seen in the different accounts of Paul, Spinoza, liberation theology, situation ethics, Aristotle, Kant, and Anscombe. In an attempt to rescue religious ethics from scientifically oriented philosophy, we considered social and genetic accounts of religion as well as quasi-realism and phenomenology. But whatever credibility these accounts had, and they were able to offer viable perspectives, they were not able to salvage classical theories of religious ethics that offered an objective ethics and a God that existed literally as a distinct being. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meetings or on a website like Zoom or meetup.com. I could add that I gave lectures on religious ethics 25 years ago that said a lot more than I did here. But I hope that what I said here is more relevant to a philosophy of life in terms of value, and that religious ethics is another inadequate moral theory that has been eliminated.